Yeah, brilliant. I'll tell you, think of the craziest surgery you could think of. So I can't think of a crazier one than stopping a person's heart to open a person's head, dig as deeply into a person's brain as you can with a tiny clip the size of a mosquito wing.
Hi, I'm Brilliant, your host for this show. I know that I'm incredibly blessed. As the son of self-made billionaires, I've seen the high price some people pay for success, and I've learned that money really can't buy happiness. But I've also had the good fortune to learn directly from many of the world's leading teachers. If you're ready to be, do, have, and give more, this podcast is for you. My guest today is Tony Bartelme. He's author of A Surgeon in the Village, An American Doctor Teaches Brain Surgery in Africa. It's an incredible true story of a surgeon, a brain surgeon, Dr. Dilan Ellegala, who travels to Tanzania after 15 years of being inside the medical establishment, learning to be a brain surgeon in the United States. In this interview, we cover so much about, again, the difference one person can make. Tony is a very talented journalist. He's an investigative journalist and narrative storyteller. He's been nominated for the Pulitzer Prize 3 times. I love this review on the Washington Post, that A Surgeon in the Village is a harrowing and important book. I'll just share with you this one last fact, which we talk about in the interview. We'll get right into it. But you know that 5 billion people on this planet live without access to adequate surgical care? That means 17 million people die every year who wouldn't otherwise. When Dilan went to Tanzania, there were about 5 brain surgeons in a country of 42 million people. Fortunately, through the work that he has done and is doing, that's changing in Tanzania and elsewhere. With that, I hope you enjoy this conversation with my new friend, Tony Bartelme. Tony, welcome to the School for Good Living.
Great to be here with you, Brilliant.
Tony, will you tell me, please, what's life about?
What's life about? I think life is about a journey to find the true you, which is easier said than done.
It's like you set me up perfectly for the next question, which is, who are you? What do you do? How do you commonly answer that question anyway, or how do you like to?
So I am, my profession, I don't think that's me, but my profession is as a storyteller, a storyteller who writes things. I am a searcher, an investigator. I try to find subjects and issues that go beyond the obvious because we already know what's obvious.
Yeah. Although my dad used to say, nothing is obvious to everyone.
He's right. Because once you dig deeper, the obvious, there's always one more layer.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, with that, and recognizing your long career in journalism and this investigative reporting, this narrative storytelling, one thing I'm really interested to know is, how do you choose your subjects? I mean, I realize you probably got an editor. You've got people who are asking you to take assignments or inviting you to. But how do you like to choose? What are the stories that you like to investigate?
So almost every good story begins with a conversation, just like we might be having today. So somebody inevitably comes up to me and says, Tony, you ought to look at this. You ought to investigate this. Or I can't believe I just heard about that. And then from there, you just go deeper. And I try to find stories that I'm interested in personally. If you can find a story that you can actually grow from as you investigate, then you've got that kind of congruency, I guess, that allows you to really, it taps into that inner passion, that inner motivation. And then pretty soon you're growing with the things you're investigating, and it's like a beautiful tree.
So there's a story that you followed, and I understand it might have been as long as 5 years, that became your book, A Surgeon in the Village, An American Doctor Teaches Brain Surgery in Africa. But will you tell me, how did this story come to you, or how did the conversation that initiated this book begin? And what was this journey like?
So it began with a conversation. An editor walked over to me in the newsroom where I work one day, and he says, I just met this crazy brain surgeon. He lives here in Charleston, and he 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 told me all these crazy stories about opening up people's brains in somewhere in the middle of Africa with a tree saw. You ought to sit down with him and find out what he's doing. And so I did. And I called him up and set up an appointment to meet him at a restaurant a few blocks from where I'm sitting right now, right near the medical school. And I remember getting there on time, and he arrived. He didn't arrive for 10, 15, 20 minutes. And I kept thinking, man, brain surgeon. He's probably got a God complex. He's probably a real jerk. And then he walks in, and he's this 6'4" guy. He's got a shaved head, which is perfect for teaching brain surgery. You can point to what you're going to do to somebody's head. He's in his scrubs, and he sits down, and I was a little ticked. And he sits down and he immediately apologizes. And he said, I was caught in a surgery. And with my little chip on my shoulder, I said, piece of cake, right? And he loved that, because people tend to treat brain surgeons as these deities.
Wow.
And it immediately, you could almost see his shoulders relax. Oh, okay, I can have a conversation with this dude. And then we were off, and he told me his story.
Now, I realize it might be unfair to ask you, well, what was the story, right? I mean, that's why you wrote a book. That was what you spent years, right?
Yeah. Well, his story was his story. It started off with failure. He was this aspiring brain surgeon. He's going through med school, and he goes through his residency. And for a brain surgeon, it takes 15, 16, 17 years to really become a really fully qualified brain surgeon. You have to go through med school and then residency, and the residency can be 7-8 years. And so he's going through this process, this incredible journey up Mount Everest. And by the end of that journey, he is exhausted and burnt out. He can, his relationships are in pieces. He's really developed some addictions to really sort of sexual addictions, where you kind of use sex as a way of avoiding pain. And so he was a mess, and he knew it, because he's a really deep thinker. And so he decides, well, I've reached the pinnacle of my career. I'm going to go take a 6-month vacation in the middle of Tanzania with my girlfriend, and I'm just going to relax. And so he goes to Tanzania, and then he realizes that Tanzania and the rest of the developing world, and really in the United States as much as anything, that there's this desperate shortage of skilled surgeons out there. And when he arrived, he said there were only 5 brain surgeons. And I remember saying, well, 5 brain surgeons, that seems like a lot. And he said, no, 5 brain surgeons for the entire country of Tanzania, that's 42 million people with 5 brain surgeons. That's about the same number of brains. So that's the same number of people from Florida to Virginia with 5 brain surgeons. So people die because of the lack of skilled surgeons. And so then we finished the lunch, and he said, Tony, Tanzania is awesome. You got to come see it. That's only teaching, the experience is the greatest teacher. So come to Tanzania with me. And, oh, by the way, I got married on an airstrip in front of 4,000 villagers.
So there's a love story.
I thought, oh, okay. Love story. I think I can write about this.
Wow. So you went to Tanzania multiple times, right, to write this. What was your experience like?
So I went 5 times for about 5 months overall. And I remember my first visit, I went and I flew to a large city in Tanzania, and then I took this tiny little plane, this little Cessna plane that Dilan Ellegala, this was the name of the brain surgeon. He's from Sri Lanka. Dilan Ellagala took that same plane when he first went to Tanzania, which was great for a a writer to do, because then you're able to build a narrative around the same experiences. So I remember I took this tiny little plane flying over the bush, seeing these little circles down below, and I remember asking him, what are those circles down there? And he said, they're actually they're thickets that villagers put around their huts to keep the wild animals out. And the landscape was awesome, as he said. And then we landed on this dirt airstrip with all the villagers waiting to see him. So it was just this, amazing entrance.
Yeah. I've had the opportunity to visit Tanzania myself. I've never been to Hatem, where this hospital is located, but I love the people that I've met. The countryside is beautiful. I haven't spent 5 months there, but what a privilege, what an experience, and what an incredible story, right? I mean, you mentioned opening someone's head with a wood saw to conduct brain surgery, and people listening might not realize, the impact of not having access to a brain surgeon, a surgeon of any kind, but a brain surgeon in the bush. But in your book, which I read some parts of kind of through my fingers, just hearing these stories of hyena attacks or children with hydrocephalus or people who got hit with a stick, who would have died for sure if it wasn't for, what are these extraordinary things that we take for granted, at least the availability, I think, here in the developed world. But this insight that Dilan had, and I love that you point out in the book that the Latin root of doctor. Will you talk about that and about how that informed his view of making a difference, sharing his gifts and his knowledge with people in Tanzania and in Africa?
Yeah, so the Latin root for doctor is teacher. Teacher. And teaching in medicine is part of it. The medicine's DNA. There's an old saying that I'm sure you've heard: see one, do one, teach one. That's the sort of foundation of modern medicine. And so Dilan, he arrives in Tanzania and he realizes that this vacation that he had set up, he's confronted with the incredible suffering around him. There are 5 billion people around the world without access to proper surgical care, and there are 17 million people die every year because of the absence of qualified surgeons. So, if you think about serious medical problems around the world, we're not really paying attention to maybe the most important one, which is the shortage of doctors. And, 17 million people dying is more than malaria, diabetes, and emphysema combined.
Yeah.
So he goes to Tanzania. So he arrives on his vacation, and he's confronted with his suffering, and he realizes that he has the skills to help a lot of people. But when he leaves, what will he leave behind? And so he decides to try a different approach.
Teaching. Yeah. One of the things that really cemented for me the decision to read your book and Dilan's story was an Amazon review that talked about a lady wrote something about her husband who's not a reader. For whatever reason, he read the book and he couldn't put it down. And that was my experience reading this book. It was clear to me that you have a great skill, not only to help the reader place themselves in this world, that's very far from home for those of us who live in the United States, but to have this experience being right alongside this incredible suffering, as you mentioned, that's present all over the world, but in a form that we don't see every day here. And then to take us along on this journey, like you said, there was this aspect perhaps of failure, right? Where then there was this effort, maybe the hero's journey, where Dilan left. And then he decided, and this was something that you point to, right? You talk about the biggest global health problem you've never heard of, this thing about the lack of access to surgical care, which I had similarly never heard of. But then what was the solution, right? Because this medical mission model that has been happening, I think in your book you point out that in one trip to Mexico, one church got painted 6 times in a summer. It's like, that's probably really not helping anyone. And it's well-meaning. People want to make a difference, but we maybe don't know how, or we don't have the faith that we can. But Dilan, I think, approached this in a different way. Will you talk about how he approached this teaching model and using what he knew and what he could do to make a difference, and how this maybe, I'm stacking a bunch of questions here, but then how we might be able to follow some of the example that he set in that regard to make a difference in the world?
Yeah. So a lot of people go on these medical missions with the best of intentions. They go, and I think there are 6,000 medical missions a year, to places like this Haydn Lutheran Hospital. And when people go, these doctors and nurses and dentists, they try to treat as many people as they can, and then they really, people work so hard. The compassion is amazing, but then they leave, and so then you're left with that ongoing surgical, skilled medical gap. And so Dilan's sitting there watching all this, and he's thinking, is there a better way? So he decides, he identifies a medical officer, and this is in East Africa. You have kind of a slightly different type of medicine, medical hierarchy. And so there was a clinician named Emmanuel Maega, and he had a bit of medical training in the past. He probably equivalent to maybe a physician assistant, between a paramedic and a physician assistant in the United States. So Dilan sees something in Maega that Maega can't see in himself. And that's really the key. That's what teachers and coaches do. They see something in others that those people can't see in themselves. And then they open a door. They create a door for that person, that opportunity to walk through. And Dilan saw this very interesting guy, Emmanuel Maega, who had the walk and the poise and the little bit of an arrogance of a surgeon. And he kind of coaches Maega into thinking that maybe he could actually do some brain surgery, even though he's not even a medical doctor. And so Dilan spends 6 months bringing Maega along, using that see one, do one, teach one philosophy. And, lo and behold, he's able to teach Maega how to do some pretty complicated brain surgeries. And then he does something different. And this is the key. He teaches Maega how to teach others. He teaches all the skills and all the coaching techniques that he used on Maega on a second newly minted Tanzanian doctor, and then teaches him how to teach, and then he teaches a third. And so suddenly, in a country that only had 4 or 5 brain surgeons, you've almost doubled it just through that teach a man to fish philosophy.
Yeah, amazing. Well, you mentioned the love story here as well. Where does that factor in?
So the love story was A, it was just an awesome story, but B, it was symbolic. So Dilan's here, he's sitting there with his girlfriend, 6 months, teaching brain surgery. But his relationship with his girlfriend there, he knows it's over. And he again, he's wondering, I'm a failure when it comes to relationships. But then he meets a pediatrician from the Netherlands, and he's immediately love struck, and she's not. But over time, they get together, let's say, and the beauty of that relationship is that she just typified. She was this classic, I'm going to save the world medical person, full of compassion and love, and just desperately wanted to help people. And in the process, she was burning herself out. She really, literally almost killed herself just because she was trying to save so many people, so many kids. And so their marriage, or their wedding, eventually was this symbolic coming together of that teaching focused approach and the compassion the compassion that Dilan, the brain surgeon, was missing, the kind of higher altitude way to help people that Karin was missing, the pediatrician. And then, so they got married on an airstrip in front of 4,000 or 5,000 villagers. Emmanuel Maega was his best man. It was an amazing event.
Yeah, such a fantastic story. I'm curious to know, have you optioned the book? Like, have you sold the rights to the movie? I know that happens with these stories.
No, not yet. Know anybody? It's one of those sort of kind of very cinematic stories that would be a good one.
I actually do know a guy, and I'd never thought of that. But as I've been doing these interviews for the last 3 years, I've learned, that happens with books that I wouldn't have thought. But at any rate, if you want, I'd love to make an email introduction and see if it goes anywhere. But
thanks. I think good stories are really often about private. People love to learn about people's private experiences amid these grand, important settings.
Yeah, and I've heard it said that the intimate is the most universal. So there is this, grand saga we're all a part of, and yet we're all having our own experiences. So
nice.
Yeah. Okay. How did writing this book? I'm assuming it did, right? So there's an assumption baked into this question, but how did writing this book change your life?
Yeah, I learned one lesson after another about life, and that's the beauty of just. I'm really grateful that I'm able to, learn with the people I investigate, and so for Dilan and Karin, I got to know them really well, and I got to know how they struggled and how they succeeded, and really in the end, I was left with an amazing lesson that failure is a gift. As long as you learn from it. Because failure gives you the energy, the energy to do something. It's a signal. It's a flashing light to make a change. And if you learn from it, that's how human beings move forward. So that important lesson to me was something I sort of knew but didn't really experience, and I couldn't really articulate it until I did that book. And then I just the richness of the people you meet are just I feel much wealthier spiritually after meeting all these people.
Yeah, that's beautiful. In the book where you talk about failure and how this is one of the things that separates the best surgeons from those that don't persist as surgeons, that actually really touched me as well. And you mentioned that book, Forgive and Remember.
Yeah.
Right. About this. And to me, there was also a really significant lesson in there about responsibility, right? Where those who didn't make it as a surgeon would blame other people or circumstances or bad luck or whatever. But that was really powerful.
Yeah, that was they did interesting study where they looked at successful surgeons and then ones that failed out of their surgical programs. And they found, the successful surgeons were the ones who, owned what happened, wouldn't stop talking about it, it was as if they were re-experiencing their failures over and over. And the ones who failed blamed others. So owning that failure, but also recognizing that it's not the end of the world, that is really a sign of that you're moving forward. Ooh, yeah, that's what it's about.
Yeah, and then demonstrating that in a very human way in the book as well, and to come full circle with that procedure, which I'd never heard of, about a standstill. Will you talk about what that is, and also maybe Dilan is the case in point of the successful surgeon who does forget, or rather forgive and remember.
Yeah, brilliant. I'll tell you, think of the craziest surgery you could think of. So I can't think of a crazier one than stopping a person's heart to open a person's head dig as deeply into a person's brain as you can with a tiny clip the size of a mosquito wing, and then digging through all these blood vessels while this person, his heart has been stopped, with their body temperature going down, getting colder and colder. In fact, you got to cool the room to make sure the person doesn't completely go die. So this person is on the edge of death. Their brain waves are flat. Their heart isn't beating. And a surgeon is digging deep into the person's brain to put a clip on a tiny little blood vessel. Any mistake he or she makes, and the person will die. And after about 30, 40 minutes, you can keep a person sort of on that edge for about 30, 40 minutes. Any longer, and then the person won't wake up. And so that's what you call a standstill operation to fix an aneurysm in the brain.
This, by the way, was one of those moments for me.
Yeah, I was fortunate to witness one of those operations, and boy, you wouldn't think that it was as crazy as it is, because these guys are so cool and calm and collected, but
yeah,
it's crazy.
Well, in the part too that you talk about in the book for many years, and I don't remember the hospital, maybe you recall it. I'm thinking of Bellevue, but where above the surgical area, the words were, "Prepare to meet your maker."
Prepare to, yeah. Talk about a really bad attitude, but above, yeah. So you're sitting there on your bed about to get cut open. Yeah. Prepare to meet your maker was a sign above you. And
things have changed.
Yeah.
Thank goodness. Well, before we transition our conversation, I want to ask, what do you hope? Like, first of all, was there a specific audience that you wrote this book for? And if so, who was it? And what did you want them to take away from it?
So my audience really was anybody, but especially students and people who are interested in helping others. That was my main goal, because this, I think, helps you think a little more deeply about helping others.
Yeah.
And I hope in a way that helps more people in better ways.
Yeah, I think it is. I think it's working. But are you seeing that that's happening now that the book has been out a few years?
I've had some really nice anecdotal moments where, I remember meeting a medical or a student who was struggling and really didn't know what he wanted to do with his life. And he basically quit school, and he read the book, and he decided to go pre-med and become a doctor. So that was nice. And then I met a guy who ran a program for medical missions for students. And he did it in Latin America, and he read the book, and he said, "Oh, I need to change my entire business model."
Wow. And
so he began doing kind of both, missions for students, and then also setting up a teaching focused program for dentistry in the Dominican Republic. So things like that, really, that was, nice. That made it all worthwhile.
Yeah, that's great. And you probably know this better than I, having written many more words than me and sent them out much more broadly into the world, but we never know, right? The impact that our words will have.
No, we never know. But if you do a positive intention, no matter what it is, it can't hurt.
Yeah. Well, and you relating that story of that student who had dropped out made me think about something you include in the book, where Dilan, from an early age, like 4 years old, had seen his uncle as a doctor. And Dilan, growing up in Sri Lanka, had told his parents, "I'm going to be a doctor." Right? I was so impressed by the impact that had on the whole Ellegala family and the certainty that a 4-year-old had. But what I wonder is, and then he followed that life path, as you said, 15 years through medical school, becoming a brain surgeon, on the path to be the best in the world. but not all of us have that kind of clarity from such an early age. What's your view of how we can find it more easily than, we might otherwise, if we don't already look inside and know for sure, what our path is?
Yeah, that's a great question because, so Dilan is this guy with, who has this very, very clear intention at a very young age. He's living in the mountainous area of Sri Lanka and goes up to his parents one day and says, I'm going to be a doctor like my uncle. And from then on, his parents thought, yeah. And so they began to shape their lives around that intention. Our son could be a doctor. And eventually they decided to actually leave Sri Lanka, leave their home and move to the United States. And they moved from Sri Lanka to the South Dakota. Talk about a change in scenery. So they really sort of created this very nurturing environment for that original intention. And so really that's, I think, the lesson is the power of a clear intention, but that we all have that in us.
Right.
So it's, I think, a matter of just recognizing that. And then everything, things can kind of come together once that clarity is reached.
Yeah. So amazing. Just think that out of the mouth of babes kind of thing, this 4-year-old, and the parents, like you said, they start to shape their whole lives around it and support him in his intention. And I was just reminded of the power of our speaking, the power speaking can have, and the power that intention can have.
Yeah. It's funny. I gave a talk a couple of years ago in the Detroit area in front of a bunch of medical residents. And there's about 150 people in the room. And I asked them, how many of you, just raise your hands, how many of you knew you were going to be a doctor when you were a kid? I'd say 80% raised their hands.
Wow. That's
power of intention.
Yeah, that is powerful. Well, what related to this book have we not covered?
So the challenge for me, the challenges of writing this book were really hard. So it's from a writing standpoint, writing about a country that you've really never been to, about a field you know nothing about, or very little about, and then writing it with authority required a lot of work and a lot of fun because, so Maega ended up learning how to do brain surgery, and he operated on a bunch of patients. And I didn't know, if he was telling me the truth. And as a writer, I mean, that's the first thing you got to find out is whether people are telling the truth. And so I went out in search of Maega's patients, and that may have been the most fun I had on the entire project was looking for Maega's patients, because this area was incredibly remote. Nobody has addresses. A lot of these patients came from areas that were, an hour or two away. And so it was like finding a needle in a haystack. And so we ended up going out with a couple of translators and just riding down these dirt roads to the end of the earth, it felt like. And then I remember one time we were looking for a guy who'd been hit in the head with a stick, and it was one of Maega's first patients. And I found his wife, and she says, no, he's over there, over the hill, with his second wife. And so we go over to his second wife and down these long roads and paths and over through rivers. And then they said, no, he's over there, down some road. And so again, we'll go another hour. We're hiking and driving through another place. And then we bump into a bunch of people who were completely drunk. They were just sitting around drinking homemade whatever. And they kind of basically said, no, he's over that way. Finally, so we spend the whole day looking for the guy. Finally, we bump into a guy we see a guy on the road, and we ask, hey, do you know where this guy is? And he said, oh yeah, he's running from you.
Who did he think you were?
He thought we were the cops.
Wow.
And so that was it's a treasure hunt, and we ended up finding most people, not him, but we figured, if he can run from us for an entire day, that brain surgery worked.
Yeah. Amazing. Well, that's so great. Well, thank you for sharing of your experience. I came across in my research this idea that you like your subjects to involve some sort of quest, and it certainly sounds like this gave you that.
Yeah, no, people are infinitely interested in how others manage their decisions.
Yeah.
And that's, stories are how we learn. And what better story is one about a quest to learn, or a quest to grow, a quest to overcome.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, with your permission, I want to go ahead and transition us to the enlightening lightning round.
Oh, cool.
Okay. So again, this is a series of questions on a variety of topics. You're welcome to answer as long as you want. My aim, for the most part, is to ask the question and stand aside. I might pull on a response here and there, but that's the basic design. Okay. Question number 1. Please complete the following sentence with something other than a box of chocolates. Life is like a
long hike up a mountain.
Okay. Question number 2. What important truth do very few people agree with you on?
Damn, that's a hard one. Oh. Dude, that's a great question.
I should acknowledge it's the famous technologist and investor Peter Thiel's question, but I do love the question.
Oh, you're going to have me thinking for about the next 3 days on that one.
Okay, and we can come back too.
Yeah, let me set that one aside, because that's a good one.
Okay, maybe one of these others will jog something loose too. So we'll keep going, and I'll come back to it at the end. Question number 3. If you were required every day for the rest of your life to wear a t-shirt with a slogan on it, or a phrase, or a saying, or a quote, or quip, what would the shirt say?
I am the truth, and so are you.
That one I want to know a little more about.
Well, I think it has a lot to do with this idea of a quest. We're all, I think, on a quest to be the people who we are. And we're given all this programming at the beginning of our lives, and our parents put a little bit into us, and others put into us, and social media takes a lot out of us. And so we're on this journey, and the closer to who we get, time and again, I've just seen people who are more, the closer to who they are, the more realized they are, the calmer they are, the more, the people who are comfortable in their own skin, those types.
I love that. Thank you. Okay, question number 4. What book, other than one of your own, have you gifted or recommended most often?
The Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky's fantastic book that basically, I think, explains everything.
Okay. What are you reading right now?
I'm reading this wonderful book called Why Fish Don't Exist by Lulu Miller. And it's this, I'm only about a third into it, but it's this part memoir, part meditation on this theme of order and chaos. And she's a wonderful science writer, and love it.
Sounds cool. All right. Thank you for that. Question number 5. So we've talked about the travel, some of the travel you've done already in this interview. But what's one travel hack, meaning something you do or something you take with you when you travel, to make your travel less painful or more enjoyable?
I always pack really light. So, I went to Tanzania with a single backpack, and just the less you have, the less you have to worry about. Less I lose stuff, so less I have to lose. And if you do lose something, you really know it. So, one bag.
What have you lost when you were traveling that caused you some consternation?
God, everything. I think I guess I've never lost a laptop.
Never left it in the seat back pocket?
No, but I've lost phones. I've lost wallets. I've lost, yeah, passports.
Wow. Okay. Question number 6. What's one thing you've started or stopped doing in order to live or age well?
Well, this is a minor thing, but it's something I did recently where I just went completely offline, and get disconnected from the internet. And I think that's increasingly important going on a digital diet. And also, another thing that I just did recently. I don't know. Have you ever heard of Wim Hof?
I have. Yeah, the Iceman.
Yeah, the Iceman. Yeah. So I've always tried to do some meditation. And in fact, the line kind of got me into meditation, and I had a little trouble with it. And so I came across this guy Wim Hof, this crazy guy from the Netherlands, and his big thing is taking deep breaths and really hyperventilating, and then taking cold showers or ice baths. But I've really found that his breathing technique is really a wonderful form of active meditation that kind of leads to a deeper kind of meditation in general.
That's awesome. All right. Question number 7. I phrased this question, what's one thing you wish every American knew? Although one of my guests suggested I phrase it, what's one thing you wish every United States citizen knew? But either way, you prefer the phrasing. How do you answer the question?
The first thing that comes to mind is that I wish every U.S. citizen could go to China, go to Hong Kong, go to and realize and see how we're not moving forward that well. I think that opens. I think that would open a lot of people's eyes. I'm a richer person for visiting China and realizing that we're just we're not up to snuff in a lot of ways these days.
What's one example of that for you?
The American culture is so focused on consumption and so focused on building our own little private gardens that we forget that we're part of this larger community sometimes, not always. And because of that, we're kind of alone and we're not working together like we should. We've seen that politically. We're seeing that in lots of other ways. So yeah.
Thank you for that. Question number 8. What's the most important or useful thing you've ever learned about making relationships work?
Honesty is, I think, the key. And that's really being honest with yourself. And, as soon as you start fantasizing or thinking about the future, then you're creating these false narratives. So I think living in the moment, that's what I try to do. I fail all the time, but if you live in the moment with your relationship, the future will take care of itself.
Yeah. Plus, I think that's why we call it a practice, right?
Yeah. Nice.
Question number 9. Aside from compound interest, what's the most important or useful thing you've ever learned about money?
Oh, don't invest in the stock market, or at least don't try, because I suck at it. I lost a lot of money. No, I didn't. I lost a little bit of money because writers don't make any money. But yeah, I don't know. Leave that to the experts.
Okay. And I'll come back to the other just to see if there happens to be anything this time. But what important truth do very few people agree with you on?
Damn, that's a good one. So I'm trying to think, what do people agree? What do people disagree with me about? And that's where I'm stuck.
Okay. Let me go in what might seem a bit of a random direction, but really fascinated by the TED Talk you gave on plankton. And you learned a lot. You shared a lot in that brief talk about plankton. But was there something you learned in that either many people didn't know or for whatever reason didn't agree with you on or don't agree with you on?
Yeah. So my investigation into plankton was again another really rich journey because, I didn't know anything about plankton, but plankton, these little, specifically phytoplankton, are produce half of the oxygen on Earth, or as I said in my talk, every other breath. And the climate change is creating this giant chemistry experiment in our oceans where our plankton, our most important oxygen producers, live, and we don't really know what's going on. And so again, that was one of those stories that's hidden in plain sight. What's more important than the air we breathe? So yeah, that was a beautiful story because I actually, and to try to really tell it well, you can't just sort of hit people over the head and say, "Oh, plankton, you're going to die because your oxygen is going down the tube." So I really had to create this story about beauty and a mystery, because people are not going to read 5,000 words about plankton, but they will read books about beauty. They will read books about mysteries. And so really, that was really the important thing to me, was really to get that the wonder of beauty, the wonder of these little critters, and the wonder and the mystery of it all. You shape the story around those themes.
Oh, all right. Thank you for that. Okay, the last question here in the enlightening round is kind of a gimme. It's if people want to learn more from you or they want to connect with you, what would you have them do?
Well, one easy way is just go to my website, tonybartelme.com, and it's a tongue twister. So just Google me, and then I'm just happy to talk to anybody about what's on their minds.
Awesome. Okay, well, just a few last questions for you about creativity and writing. But before we go to that part of the interview, I just want to share with you that as an expression of gratitude to you for making time to talk with me and everyone listening, I've done two things. One is I've made a microloan to a woman entrepreneur in Cambodia named Simone. She earns $4 a day, and she'll use this money to buy cassava seedlings, soil, and fertilizer for her farm, and in the process improve the quality of life for herself, her family, and her community. So thank you for giving me a reason to do that.
Well, that's wonderful.
Yeah. And the other thing is I went to Madaktari Africa's website and I made $100 donation to them for the work they're doing.
Oh, nice.
On your behalf. So thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you.
Pretty cool. Okay. So the last part of the interview here, writing and creativity. Man, I'm going to start with let me start with this. When did you first know yourself to be a writer?
Oh, it took a long time. Talk about failure. I went to journalism school, but mainly because my math made my head hurt. So, even into my senior year in journalism school, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I remember took one of those career tests. I think they still do them, where you answer questions. Basically, researchers interview thousands of people who say they are happy in their careers, and then they match their personality traits with yours. And so I took this test, and I'm actually answered the questions in such a way that I hope the results would skew away from journalism. Got the results back. Lo and behold, off the charts, says I should be a reporter. I'd be happiest being a reporter. So made me wonder if all those happy journalists had lied to their researchers. But so here I ended up in my first job at a journalism school. It was, of course, with an engineering company, right? Again, didn't know what I wanted to do, but I was bored within 6 months, and I took I was making good money, but I was dying inside. And so I took the first job I could in Greenville, South Carolina. Massive. I was making $12,000 a year. It was poverty line wages. But that's when I realized, when I started actually doing it, that I had found the career that I was probably born to do. But it didn't happen. It was not a clear and linear path.
Did it ever become clear? And if so, how? How and when? What made it clear?
So early on, I remember I was sitting at my desk. This is, I was 22, 23 years old, about 22. And I was sitting at my desk the editor comes over to me and he hands me a press release, and it's about it was a Christmas tree in a mall. It was angel tree, they call it. And he said, "Tony, go ahead and do a story about this angel tree." And I looked at it and I thought, oh God, this is not what I was born to do. So I was a little ticked off. So I said, I'm going to go to that mall and look at that stupid angel tree. And so I go out there and I looked at the angel tree. It was a few days before Christmas. It was empty. Nobody had given any donations. I thought, well, that's okay. So I went back. I spent a little time writing it. They put it on the front page, and just kind of the way I wrote it. And then the next day, the tree was completely full. Wow. That was my first sort of experience of, A, you do a little extra, go a little deeper, and B, man, what I'm doing might actually help people.
That's really cool. When you say you went deeper with that story, how did you go deeper? Because it seems on the surface pretty straightforward. You get this assignment, you go look at the tree, it's empty. You write a piece that says, hey, the tree is empty. But how'd you go deeper with that? What did that mean to you?
Well, first of all, was actually going to look at the tree. And then, instead of just writing what was on the press release, that would have been the go-to thing for most people. And so digging just a little extra deeper and finding that it's not doing so well. And then I've been tried to find the story. I haven't been able to find that story I did, but it was, I remember trying to put it within the season. And I remember trying to write it better than I normally would. And at that point I wasn't the best writer. So probably wasn't a very deep story, but it seemed to resonate. And going a little extra deeper, that's always the most important thing that I can do as a reporter, is go beyond the obvious.
Yeah. Well, what's that famous saying about a drop of ink can make a million think?
Ooh, yeah. Nice.
And how cool your words had the impact of making a difference for others, even from this early time in your career. That's pretty cool. Tell me what you've learned about, how do I say this without sounding totally mystical, right? But about the energy behind words, right? Because in any communication, there's the content, but there's also the intent, or the energy, so to speak. What have you learned about, if anything, what have you learned about that? How do you see that?
Yeah, that's a great question, because really the quality of your writing is really dependent on that energy. It's that little extra work you put in to make the word closer to what it ought to be. And writing is hard. It takes time to figure out a good metaphor that's not a cliche. It takes time to get that extra detail. It takes time to craft sentences that maybe create a bit of a rhythm and pacing that lead the reader down the page, and then to a endpoint that kind of punctuates the whole thing. And so yeah, behind every bit of writing, there's a lot of work.
Yeah, I remember when I was first exposed to that, when I was getting more serious about writing in my own life, and I called the only person I knew personally he was a New York Times bestselling author, and I asked him, he's about 35 years older than me, but he was willing to share a bit of his journey and so forth. And he talked about how, he said, now that I'm approaching my 70s, I just don't have the stamina to write like I used to. And I thought, who needs stamina? It's writing. How do you need stamina? but he said that that's a real thing, and you got to use it while you've got it and nurture it, protect it. So
that's really interesting. I hadn't really thought of that, but yeah, it is physically demanding. I mean, at the end of a day, a long writing day, my wife gives me grief because she, if I'm going through a really long writing process, I look like I've just been beaten up. My face is just a mess, and inevitably there are a bunch of Amazon packages coming because I'm distracting myself by buying stupid stuff. And so, yes, physically, it's a lot of writers will write in the morning and then quit. Writers that I've known, and just to maintain balance.
Yeah, that was one thing when I read a book by a guy named Mason Curry called Daily Rituals: How Artists Work. I don't know. Do you happen to know this book?
Mm-mm.
And
No.
he read biographies, and he read profiles and different accounts of different artists and authors, and even a couple scientists. Benjamin Franklin was in there, and Darwin was in there. But it was just this really neat book that gave a little vignette, like probably 200 of these different people. And what was remarkable to me was how little, as a percentage of a day, many of these people worked, but how prolific they ended up being, because I think they were in their zone of genius. They were doing what they loved. They did it over a period of decades. They gave their full intensity while they were in it. But I'm curious with you, what does your writing routine look like, and how do you differ? Because you're a journalist, but you're also writing books, and there's, I'm sure, a different cadence to that. Do you have a sort of routine that you follow generally? Does it change when you're in a book project? What does that look like? How do you manage your time as a writer?
So book projects are exponentially more challenging because once you reach a certain word count, I think it's, if I had to guess, be around 8,000 or 9,000 words. Just the complexity of the organization, the amount of information that you've got to, put in your internal brain's hard drive becomes just this extra lift. So a book project the Surgeon in the Village was a really hard project because I was also doing my job as a reporter. So again, you're sort of balancing everything. My routine really depends. What I try to do is when I'm really, really writing, I try to seclude myself and really and give it my all. And I might work 12, 13 hours a day and do that until I'm not functional and just not writing. And then I stop and rest. So it's a little manic. And I know other writers who kind of experience that too. It's but you got to capture that lightning, right? When it's in getting that lightning, often might take 6 hours of sitting on your butt trying to figure something out, and then boom, what happens? Something, and you're done in an hour.
Yeah, that reminds me. I didn't watch the series Mad Men. I don't know if you happened to watch it when it was out.
Yeah,
but I remember the one scene when, what's the guy's name? Draper, right? And his boss comes in when he's lying on the couch, and his boss says, I just can't get over the fact that virtually every time I come in here, it looks like you're doing absolutely nothing. But I think sometimes that's when maybe our best work is organizing itself. So
yeah. I remember in college, I took a philosophy course. We had to read Heidegger, who's like ridiculously complicated. And I remember I took a bunch of naps as I read it. It was a day full of naps as I read it because it was so demanding. And for like this glimmer of a second, I actually understood a tiny bit of it, and it's all gone now. But
I'm going to try this question. There's a disclaimer. I don't love this question, but I'm going to try it. Maybe you'll have the fantastic answer. What's the worst advice? What's the worst advice you hear given to beginning writers?
the worst advice is it. I hear a lot of people get down on it and say you'll never make any money, you'll never be able to support yourself, never be able to do it. And I would say maybe it's that discouragement. It's a tough road. But if it's something you're passionate about, if that's your thing, yeah, that's bad advice.
Yeah. And what's that? That's saying doubt kills more dreams than failure ever will.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
What have you learned about, this is like a big question just from the beginning too, but what have you learned about storytelling?
Yeah. Storytelling are these little gifts that we give each other. The little gifts of other people's experiences that allow us to, learn. And so, I think it's really important for us to give good ones.
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree. And I was intrigued as I looked at your craft. I tried to, as I was reading and just trying to comprehend what you were communicating, also going, how did he do it? How did Tony do this? When obviously you were there, as you said, you were on the ground in Tanzania for 5 months. You met these people. You went far and wide to talk with people and so forth. But there were, so 2 particular questions I was really curious about. One was dialogue, because I know like dialogue is probably for artists what drawing fingers is. It's really challenging, right? To create dialogue. And what have you learned about crafting dialogue that's human, especially when you're not necessarily working from a transcript? Because my sense was you weren't in the room for some of those conversations. But how did you approach that? So that's my first question.
Yeah, that's a great question and an important one because, I was there for a lot of the experiences, but I wasn't there for a lot, so I have to reconstruct, and that's where writers can get into this gray area of making stuff up and or not capturing it properly, and so that's where the work comes in. That's where the reporting is. Where I remember, Dilan. I wasn't with Dilan when he was running down the airstrip and bought this tree saw that he used later. And so I remember I actually walked down the airstrip with him and I asked him what color was the dust and, what kind of pants you were wearing. And so just experiencing those with the subject can help make it more accurate. And that's the most important thing you can do. And then dialogue, dialogue is gold when you're a writer because it really livens up a story. And I would always try to, I would say, Dilan, what do you remember saying? And then I would try to corroborate that with somebody else to make sure that he didn't make it up. And I don't think he did, but you just want it to be as accurate as you can.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's where the work comes in. And that's the difference between sort of average reporting and building a narrative. You build a full palette, and the more colors, the more accurate it is.
Yeah. And you touched on the second question before I even asked it, which was also then about detail, for these events that you weren't there. When I remember there was one passage where you talked about the tone in his voice, this kind of thing. And I just wondered, like, how do you know? Right. Because I remember I collected stories about my father 5 years after he passed. And I talked to about 200 people, and they would tell me, and right, there's that writer's advice of show, don't tell. But there's that challenge of people tend to tell you, well, he did this, he said this, this happened. But the color and so forth, and that balance between being accurate when you weren't the firsthand experiencer, but then also attempting to give that gift of a story or, something to the reader that makes it so they can picture it and ideally so they feel it.
Yeah, that's the challenge. So it makes you a really irritating interviewer. So I would say, all right, Dilan, let's walk into that room where you met with all of the medical students, and then you told them that they were all sitting in the front row, and that really ticked him off because he felt that was this sort of colonialism. And so he one day asks the medical students to move to the rear and let the Tanzanians move to the front, or not but make them move to the front. And so they all change places. And so I wasn't there when that happened. So, but the room was there. So I walked in one day, years later with Dilan and said, all right, where were you? Where exactly were you? Point exactly to where, what were you wearing? And what did it smell like? What did it sound like? and then you start building those details. Fortunately, I was lucky. Dilan Ellegala has a wonderful memory. He's a smart dude, so that helped. And plus, I took a lot of pictures, and that would help too. And you kind of build your palette.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you for that. How did you? The question I want to ask here is about. Well, the first question is: did you upset anyone with this book? Did you disappoint anybody? Did you piss anybody off?
Yeah, I did. So a lot of the book is set in Haidam, a little town in Tanzania, and it's there's a Lutheran hospital, Haidam Lutheran Hospital there. That's the setting, and it was set up by Norwegians 60, 70 years ago, and was really, a Norwegian family was really running the hospital for years and years and years and years. And some of the Norwegian family members still were active in it. And I talked to them, and over time, they really love their story. They love they think they did something wonderful there, and they did. But they thought that I was writing a book about them. And, and I can see why that, because I asked so many questions, and I was very, actively trying to understand that their story. But the book wasn't about them, and they were really mad.
Wow. As I've been studying writing, recently been introduced to the idea that fear is actually what gets in the way, right? We interpret it in different ways, of stress or resistance or, other things. But one of them I know from people who want to write a memoir, or people who just want to write some other kind of nonfiction, sharing their knowledge in a way that will help other people, that they are afraid of those very things, that they will upset somebody, they will let somebody down, it won't be good enough or whatever. Did you have those fears? Like, you probably didn't know that you were going to upset this Norwegian family when you were writing, but I imagine that you must have faced some kinds of fears or doubts, as we all do, in the process, but you persisted and you published. And I'm really glad you did. But did you face those? And if so, what did they look like for you, and how did you move past them?
Yeah, that's a wonderful topic, because fear in writing. Yeah, because I one of my biggest fears was that I wouldn't be able to do it well. And then, that's sort of for all of my stories, that, are you doing it? Did you do a good job? And then you just you got to set that aside. I know there were points when I was working on that book, I was so into it, my identity was so attached to it, that I lost myself a little bit, and that was not a good thing. And that would be a advice I would give to aspiring writers, to remember who they are, that then they're not their writing. They can step outside of it, and everything will be okay. But my identity became a little too connected to it. So there's that fear, and I see that fear in a lot of other writers, younger writers especially, who are afraid to kind of really get at the heart of a story. They're too dependent on other people dominating the story. So it's sort of this he said, she said type of story. But after a while, if you dig deep enough, you're the authority, you're the writer, you're the storyteller, and you got to have that confidence to shape it.
Awesome.
That's a great question.
You've been so generous with your time and sharing of your experience and what you've learned. I know there's so much more we could talk about, but I think my two final questions here. One is about any other advice or encouragement that you would leave someone listening with, particularly those who are in the middle of their creative endeavor. The other is just generally, if there's anything else that we haven't touched on from life or your work or what you're learning right now or anything. So in some order, however you choose, would you be willing to answer those two very poorly worded questions?
No, I really loved your questions, because you're obviously a deep thinker, and that's what it's about. And I'll say that with this thought in mind, because when I'm trying to work on a story, sometimes play a little game with myself. I ask myself, what's the story about? And then very quickly, I answer that question. So it might be about plankton. And I ask myself, well, no, what's the story really about in one word, one or two words? Well, maybe it's about climate change. No, what's the story really about? Mystery. Okay, what's the story really about? I try to go until I can't think of anything more, and that I've reached, and this is the important thing, that I've reached some sort of universal theme, something that is raw and real and is universal, that we all can relate to. And once I've kind of reached that level, that helps guide my reporting. It helps guide my writing. And you can play that game with an email. You can play it with a 5,000, 10,000 word story. You can do it with a book. And I did that with a surgeon in the village. And originally I wrote it and I thought, oh, it's really about the transformational power of teaching. But I didn't really get to the real word, the real theme, the most important theme, which was failure, until after I wrote it.
Wow.
And then the failure is the gift that we all give each other if we learn from it.
Amazing. Okay. Well, Tony, we'll wrap there. Thank you so much again for sharing so generously of your experience. And I know you certainly don't need my approval or my affirmation, but I think you're a wonderful writer. I loved this book. I'm so glad you wrote it. I do feel motivated to do something to help close this gap of 17 million people a year who die around the world for lack of adequate surgical care. And I wouldn't have known that if you hadn't have done it. So I'm just at the end of our time together and of reading your book and reflecting what you wrote, I'm filled with gratitude.
Oh, me as well. Brilliant. I really appreciate your search for depth. It's really refreshing, and thank you for that.
Hey, thanks so much for listening to this episode of the School for Good Living podcast. Before you take off, I just want to extend an invitation to you. Despite living in an age where we have more comforts and conveniences than ever before, life still isn't working for many people. Whether it's here in the developed world where we deal with depression, anxiety, loneliness, addiction, divorce, unfulfilling jobs or relationships that don't work, or in the developing world where so many people still don't have access to basic things like clean water or sanitation or healthcare or education, or they live in conflict zones, there are a lot of people on this planet that life isn't working very well for. If you're one of those people, or even if your life is working, but you have the sense that it could work better, consider signing up for the School for Good Living's transformational coaching program. It's something I've designed to help you navigate the transitions that we all go through. Whether you've just graduated, or you've gone through a divorce, or you've gotten married, headed into retirement, starting a business, been married for a long time, whatever. No matter where you are in life, this 9-month program will give you the opportunity to go deep in every area of your life, to explore life's big questions, to create answers for yourself in a community of other growth-minded individuals. And it can help you get clarity and be accountable to realize more of your unrealized potential. It can also help you find and maintain motivation. In short, it's designed to help you live with greater health, happiness, and meaning so that you can be, do, have, and give more. Visit goodliving.com to learn more or to sign up today.